Poverty can be understood as a condition in which a person or group does not have enough money or resources to live at a level considered normal or acceptable in society. At its core, poverty is about lacking the means to meet life needs, but what those needs are can vary depending on context. To define poverty clearly, one must first determine what counts as basic need. These are two main ways to define needs. The narrow definition of poverty focuses on the essentials required for survival, such as food, shelter, and clothing. Under this view, a person living on the edge of starvation or without proper protection from the elements is considered poor. On the other hand, the broader definition extends beyond survival to include living standards. In this sense, people may not be starving, but if their housing, food, or clothing falls far below what the majority of society enjoys, they are still considered poor. While poverty is directly about resources, it is often tied to other challenges. Poor health, lack of education, unemployment, and even higher crime rates are commonly associated with poverty. However, these are not poverty itself. Rather, they are consequences that result from it. When people cannot meet their basic needs, it affects every other part of life, limiting opportunities and creating cycles that are difficult to escape. Historically, poverty was accepted as an unavoidable part of human life. In pre-industrial societies, total economic production was simply too low to provide everyone with a comfortable living, even if resources had been distributed equally. However, with the rise of industrialization, the situation changed. Modern economies began producing enough goods and services to support entire populations at much higher standards of living. In this new context, poverty was no longer a matter of absolute scarcity, but an equal distribution. Poverty has been a constant presence throughout human history. For thousands of years, the majority of humanity lived in conditions that will be described today as extreme poverty. Frequent hunger, limited access to food, short lifespans, and high levels of disease and mortality. However, the story of poverty is not a simple one. Its causes and development varied widely across continents and centuries, shaped by geography, climate, disease, wars, colonialism, and economic systems. The average person had little security with food supplies tied directly to weather, harvests, and local conditions. Epidemics were common and survival itself was often uncertain, yet geographical and climatic differences meant that some regions were better equipped than others to support human growth. Eurasia, for instance, had fertile soil and large domesticable animals. These conditions allowed farming and livestock to flourish, giving populations greater access to protein-rich diets, which supported human health, physical strength, and ultimately productivity. In contrast, regions with harsher climates or fewer natural resources face greater barriers to prosperity. In Europe, repeated epidemics over centuries such as the Black Death devastated populations but also created long-term immunity within surviving communities. By contrast, populations in the Americas and parts of Africa did not develop the same immunity. When Europeans arrived during the age of exploration, they brought diseases like smallpox, which decimated Native American populations who had no resistance. This demographic collapse not only caused immense suffering, but also left these societies vulnerable to conquest and colonization, deepening patterns of poverty and exploitation that lasted for centuries. European nations expanded their empires across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, reorganizing local economies to serve the needs of colonizers. Recent research by scholars suggests that colonial powers pursue different economic models that shaped long-term outcomes. Spain followed a mercantilist model, concentrating wealth in the hands of a small elite, which created deep inequality and dependence in much of Latin America. Britain, on the other hand, adopted a more liberal model in some colonies, promoting trade and property rights. This helped countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia develop strong economies, although many African and Asian colonies were still left impoverished. I am taking you guys into these different realms to be able to understand how things work. So bear with me if maybe you're not putting one and two together. After this whole essay, you're going to be able to understand it fully, okay? By the 1800s, the global population was about 1 billion people. and nearly all of them were poor modern standards. Data shows that around 94% of the world's population lived in less than $2 a day and 84% on less than $1 a day. Industrialization began to change this in Europe, North America, and parts of Asia, but inequality also grew. In urban centers like New York, slums such as Five Points housed impoverished communities with child mortality rates 3 times higher than elsewhere. The 20th century brought progress and setbacks. Extreme poverty declined in wealthy countries like Japan, Canada, and the United States, where by 2000 less than 5% of people lived on less than $1.25 a day. However, a global inequality between rich and poor nations widened as developing countries experienced much slower economic growth, Africa in particular. For example, Eritrea, once relatively developed under Italian colonialism, saw its economy collapse after decades of war for independence, leaving half of its households in poverty by the early 1990s. After World War II, poverty became a global political concern. New international institutions such as the UN, World Bank, and IMF launched programs to fight poverty and promote development. UNICEF and the Food and Agriculture Organization worked to improve health, nutrition, and education. In 2000, the UN introduced the Millennium Development Goals (MDGs), a landmark effort to cut global poverty, hunger, and disease. By 2050, the number of people living in extreme poverty had been reduced from nearly 2 billion to around 836 million, a historic achievement. How they measure that, I do not know, but I guess they know their thing, right? Despite these successes, the 21st century has seen new challenges. The global financial crisis of 2008-2009, rising food prices, and political conflicts all slowed progress. Many developing countries faced food shortages when global commodity prices rose sharply, showing how vulnerable the poor remain to global economic shocks. By 2017, about 750 million people still lived in extreme poverty, surviving on less than $1.90 a day. Imagine that. With that brief historical analytical breakdown, let us now get into the core of the subject matter at hand, and in this case exploring why poverty will not end in the modern world. In this segment, we'll be looking at two arguments that try to explain this phenomenon. One side is more philosophical and the other is politically stretched. Jeffrey Sachs, in his influential book, The End of Poverty, written in 2005, argues that humanity has the tools, knowledge, and resources to eliminate extreme poverty by 2030. In contrast, Sander Bakers, in his essay, Why Poverty Will Not End, contends that poverty is fundamentally inescapable not because of scarcity but because of human choice and ethical failure. Jeffrey Sachs built his argument on 3 pillars: empirical progress, economic potential, and global cooperation. First, Sachs demonstrates that extreme poverty has already been declining at an unprecedented rate. In 1820, more than 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. By the early 2000s, that number had fallen below 20%. This trend, Sachs argues, proves that poverty is not a permanent condition of humanity, but a transitional stage in development. Second, Sachs identifies what he calls the poverty trap. For people and countries stuck at survival or subsistence levels, small disadvantages such as lack of food, poor health, or inadequate infrastructure prevent them from generating the capital needed to invest in future growth. Yet Sachs believes this trap can be overcome through targeted investments in healthcare, education, technology, and infrastructure. By, he said, quote-unquote, priming the pump, the poor can climb onto the ladder of development and achieve self-sustaining growth. Third, Sachs emphasizes the role of collective global action. He argues that wealthy nations can afford to dedicate just a fraction of their GDP to development aid without sacrificing their own prosperity. According to his calculations, less than 1% of the income of rich nations could provide the resources needed to eliminate extreme poverty. In his view, the real obstacle is not feasibility but political will. Thus, Sachs presents poverty eradication as both economically possible and morally imperative. Without going in further, if you want to oppose what Sachs has stated, or rather said, please do put them down in the comments. And if you want an answer from me personally, I'm gonna give my own answer, right? Now let us move to Sander Baker's argument. His argument rests on a provocative claim. Poverty is not an absolute condition that can be ended, but a relative state that will always exist in unequal societies. Even if every person in the world suddenly received $1 million, some will still be considered poor in comparison to those with more. For Bakers, poverty persists because it is defined relationally, not absolutely. Bakers goes further by asserting that humanity chooses not to end extreme poverty. He reasons that if it is within our power to save people dying from hunger or preventable disease with minimal sacrifice, but we consistently fail to do so, then the conclusion is unavoidable. We do not truly want to end poverty. The real problem, he argues, is not scarcity of resources, but scarcity of will. This moral contradiction, professing to care about poverty while refusing to take sufficient action, is the foundation of his pessimism. Additionally, Bakers rejects the idea that appeals to ethics alone will work. He notes that humans are constrained by self-interest, limited altruism, and cultural conditioning. Unlike Sachs, who believes external aid and innovation can overcome the poverty trap, Bakers insists that ethical weakness ensures such solutions will always. Both recognize that wealthier societies have the resources necessary to reduce suffering dramatically, and both agree that moral responsibility plays a role. Sachs frames aid as an ethical imperative, while Bakers frames the lack of aid as evidence of ethical failure. Moreover, both thinkers highlight the role of systems rather than isolated individuals. Sachs sees systems of aid, technology transfer, and policy coordinations as engines of poverty reduction, while Bakers sees systems of inequality, global capitalism, and ethical weakness as barriers to true progress. Now let's come to the main divergence, right? This lies in possibility versus inevitability. Sachs views poverty as an economic and technical problem that can be solved with enough resources, coordination, and political will. Bakers views it as an eternal moral and social problem, inseparable from inequality itself. Another point of divergence is their treatment of ethics. Sachs assumes that once the case for ending poverty is rationally demonstrated, leaders and nations will act accordingly. Bakers dismisses this optimism, arguing that people prioritize comfort, consumption, and self-interest over the distant suffering of strangers. Thus, where Sachs appeals to our better angels, Bakers emphasizes our moral shortcomings. Finally, Sachs sees history as progressive. Poverty is declining, and continued innovation can accelerate its decline. Bakers, by contrast, views history as repetitive. Poverty persists in different forms because inequality and selfishness are constants of human society. So you may be asking which perspective is more convincing. This will depend on where you come from, right? Because Sachs' argument is inspiring, grounded in historical evidence of poverty reduction and concrete strategies for future progress, right? Yet his optimism may underestimate the depth of political inertia, corruption, and inequality that shape global systems. His reliance on aid as a solution also risks creating dependency unless paired with structural reforms. Baker's argument is powerful in its moral clarity, but it risks fatalism. By insisting poverty will never end, he may discourage action and resign humanity to accept injustice. Moreover, his focus on ethics over structure neglects the possibility that systemic reforms such as fairer trade policies, debt relief, or institutional development can reduce inequality even if poverty in a relative sense persists. A synthesis of the two perspectives may be most useful. Bakers is correct that poverty in a relative sense will always exist as long as inequality exists. However, Sachs is right that extreme poverty, the condition of living without basic needs, can be eliminated. This challenge is distinguished between absolute and relative poverty, and then setting realistic but ambitious goals to eradicate extreme poverty while reducing inequality. As we conclude the debate between Jeffrey Sachs and Sandra Beckers, we can say that poverty may never end. In the absolute sense, Beckers critiques, we can say that humanity may never create a perfectly equal world, but it can create one where no one dies of hunger, preventable disease, or lack of basic resources. The real question is not whether poverty can end, but whether humanity will choose to make its most extreme forms a relic of history. I wanted to end the video here, but something came in mind. What if billionaires actively helped end poverty? Is it even possible? That is what we are going to be finding out in the next video. And with that said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Please do like, comment, subscribe. Thank you guys for watching. For all those who made it this far, I really appreciate you guys. Please do share to whoever it may concern. Peace.